Island Harem. Five years after the end of World War II, a 32-year-old Japanese woman on Anatahan Island signaled a nearby U.S. patrol boat cruising near the beach. As the woman surrendered, she told authorities that she'd been living alone on the island with several castaways, 31 to be exact. Kazuko Higa lived with her husband, Kukuichiro, on the tiny Anatahan Island near the Marianas. One day in 1945, 31 survivors from 3 wrecked Japanese boats swam ashore, and for 3 years, the couple cohabitated the 2-by-5-mile island with the castaways. That is, until her husband was murdered. The widow then took up with one of the other men. She would later tell the press that, quote, "I felt lonely." But her new lover would be drowned 20 days later, and she was then forced to live with the man who had attacked her husband. Kazuko said, quote, "At first I repelled him coldly. I couldn't really love him." That man would also be attacked, and Kazuko moved on from one lover to another. Once Japan had made peace with America, the U.S. Navy sought to inform the holdouts that the war was over, but they thought it was a trick, and they continued with their day-to-day activities, such as training with the few machine guns they had on the beach. Kazuko eventually got tired of her circumstances and ran away from her current partner. She then signaled a U.S. patrol boat and asked to be rescued. The woman surrendered to the U.S. authorities in 1950, and the remainder of the men on the island held out for another year before also surrendering. When rumors started circulating that 6 men had perished because of her, she indignantly replied that, quote, "Actually, only 2 died because of me. One was shot, and the other was stabbed." Orders are orders. Hiro Onoda was a Japanese soldier who strictly followed the Bushido Code of Honor and samurai moral values, which urged warriors never to surrender, even if defeat was inevitable. Still, as Onoda was notified that World War II was over, he didn't believe it and continued fighting for almost 3 decades. In late 1944, Hiro Onoda arrived on Lunbang Island in the Philippines. The Japanese-occupied islands were being threatened by U.S. forces, and Major Yoshimi Taniguchi gave Onoda strict orders to stay on the land, forbidding him from ever taking his own life. Onoda was to engage in a guerrilla warfare campaign and halt any American invaders. The soldier was trained as an intelligence officer and specialized in jungle and guerrilla warfare, sabotage, and propaganda. His superior further reassured him that, quote, "It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you." In February of 1945, the Americans crushed the Japanese defenses, but Onoda had strict orders not to surrender. He ordered 3 soldiers under his command to follow him into the jungle and begin a resistance. They ignored the fact that the U.S. troops had already left the island. The devoted soldier then engaged in raids against local Filipino troops and even attacked innocent villagers, believing they were enemies in disguise. As the war ended, American forces dropped leaflets throughout the island to inform people of the outcome. As a propaganda expert, Onoda refused to believe it and reckoned they were tricks from his opponents. More leaflets would later be dropped by General Tomoyuki Yamashita with surrender orders, but Onoda and his team disregarded them. Even letters from family arrived, but they wouldn't budge. Onoda even continued his mission after one of his men escaped and surrendered in 1950, while 2 others perished from police attacks in 1954 and 1972. In 1974, a determined Japanese explorer, Norio Suzuki, reached out to Major Taniguchi and finally convinced him to surrender. Onoda was still wearing his uniform and was pardoned by the Philippine government. He would later say that, quote, "Every Japanese soldier was prepared for death. But as an intelligence officer, I was ordered to conduct guerrilla warfare and not to die." Legally dead. Ishinosuke Uwano was stationed in the Japanese half of Sakhalin Island when World War II ended. The last time his family had any contact with him was in 1958. But as a prisoner of war, he then vanished and was declared dead as late as 2000. However, Uwana would reappear in 2006, but now as a Ukrainian citizen. It wasn't uncommon for Japanese soldiers to disappear during the first years of the post-war. When the Soviets overtook the Japanese side of the northernmost Sakhalin Island, Uwana was taken as a prisoner. It was believed that Uwana had been taken to a forced labor camp, and his last confirmed sighting occurred in 1958. Still, the rest of his story is blurry. The Japanese prisoner somehow ended up in Ukraine in 1965, probably after he was allowed to resettle. He then moved to the city of Zhytomyr, married, and raised 3 children. He remained severed from his country and his past for decades while his family struggled to find him. And in 2000, they finally gave up, and Uwana was officially declared dead. It was 6 years later that the Japanese embassy in Ukraine contacted them, saying that Uwana was alive and wanted to find his surviving family in Japan. He claimed that the Soviet authorities had prevented any contact with them for years, given that he'd been captured and transferred. The 83-year-old long-lost soldier arrived in Japan in 2006 as a Ukrainian tourist and reunited with his family after 60 years. Uwana spoke in rusty Japanese, but the government promised to give him his citizenship back as the last Japanese soldier to reappear. Every German's duty. A secret Nazi resistance was formed in the months leading to the end of World War II. As the German leadership admitted that they could be defeated sooner rather than later, an elite troop of volunteers was mobilized to operate behind enemy lines. They became known as the Werewolves. In mid-1944, Heinrich Himmler initiated Operation Werwolf. It was conceived as legitimate military or paramilitary formations of German soldiers holding out for their ideology. Walter Schellenberg, head of foreign intelligence, warned Himmler that the entire operation was, quote, criminal and stupid. But the invasion of Normandy on June 6th confirmed the Nazis' worst fears and fueled the desperate actions that followed. The General Inspector of Special Defense, Hans Adolf Pritzmann, was instructed to set up the operations headquarters in Berlin to organize and train the force. But Pritzmann was always considered inefficient and weak, with several German officers calling him, quote, vain, idle, and boastful. Still, the covert endeavor was set in motion, with the intention to hold out long enough so a more favorable settlement could be arranged for Germany. The group was trained in guerrilla tactics like sniping, sabotage, assassination, and improvising explosives, and was then decentralized to allow every unit to operate independently in case the network failed. Ultimately, the resistance proved to be a minor threat, but radio propaganda promoted by Joseph Goebbels resulted in an effective psychological warfare strategy. Radio Werwolf greatly exaggerated the extent of the German forces, but it merely lasted a few weeks. For a while, the latent threat of a broader Nazi comeback frightened the Allies, but it never arrived and eventually faded away. Many historians still argue that the werewolves actually harmed German citizens more than the Allied occupants. Last German to surrender. Operation Haudegen was a meteorological expedition launched by the Germans in the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard in September of 1944. But as the war ended, they were notified about it and left to their own fate. Luckily, a Norwegian boat found them, but nobody knew what to do with them. When the war started in 1939, the German military was unable to obtain accurate information from the International Meteorological Network, which was controlled by the Allies. Consequently, they were forced to establish their own weather station in the Arctic. 11 men were marooned in the Arctic Circle for months and survived against sub-zero temperatures, forceful winds, and the constant threat of polar bears. The top-secret mission was intended to gather data on North Atlantic weather patterns, and Lieutenant Wilhelm Dega was commissioned to lead the operation. As the war ended, they were notified about it and received orders to destroy all their scientific and communication equipment. Still, no rescue operation was set in motion. On September 3, 1945, Norwegian boat Blazel, led by Captain Albertsen, arrived at the station. The Germans greeted their saviors in English, but they didn't understand the language. Then Lieutenant Higa spoke in Norwegian, which he had used fluently in his years as an interpreter for the German army. He said, quote, "Shall we start our official business right here on the beach, or may I invite you to our station for a coffee and a schnapps?" To which Albertson replied, quote, "Real coffee and a good German schnapps? Yes, of course." The following day, Albertson told Higa that he had been asked to arrest his crew, but that he didn't know how. Higa then took his pistol and put it on the table, pushing it towards the Norwegian captain. He then uttered, quote, "With this, I surrender." To which Albertson replied, quote, "May I keep the pistol?" Before heading to Europe, a formal document of surrender was stipulated in Norwegian and signed by both men. They would be the last German military unit to surrender in World War II. Thank you for watching our video. Don't forget to subscribe to our Dark Documentaries channels for more exciting content. And let us know in the comments below about any other topics of your interest.